I came across your channel by chance and wanted to share my true story, which happened many years ago. At the time, I wasn't aware of most of the details, but I later discovered the context of my memories through conversations with my parents. In about 1986, I was about 5. My dad's job moved us from Brooklyn to a bit upstate, and we bought a house in Connecticut. It was quite a change in lifestyle, from a crazy, crowded neighborhood to 3 or 4 acres on a windy road in the woods. My mom especially loved the scenery and the quiet. It should be pointed out that my mom was about 27 or so at the time, my dad about 30. All was fine for a while, until my mom grew increasingly uneasy about a man she said she was seeing everywhere she went. When she went to the supermarket, he was there and would smile at her. She took my sister and I to the park one day, and he was sitting on a bench staring at her. There were many more instances, and at some point my mom mentioned it to my dad, who I think kind of wrote it off at the time. He had never seen the guy and figured it was just a coincidence. The town wasn't terribly big. You were bound to run into people over and over. But my mom was adamant, and it began to get more frequent over the course of about a month or so. I can almost recall her always being on edge when we went places. Finally, after one such incident, she called my dad at work crying and said that she was sure now that he was watching her daily movements. She said she was leaving to pick my sister up from nursery school when she noticed a car through the trees on the road, about 50 yards up from our driveway. When she got in her car, the other car pulled out and began to follow her. With increasing worry, she drove to get my sister and went into the school. When she came out, she saw the guy who she said appeared to be her age with sunglasses on standing by his car looking at her. She had had enough at this point, and her Brooklyn kicked in, and she started yelling all manner of stuff at the guy, who promptly jumped in his car and sped off. This was enough for my dad, who came home from work and promptly called the police. I remember they came to the house and spoke to my parents in the other room. Well, as luck would have it, the police knew exactly who the guy was, as he had been on their radar for a similar incident a few years before with another woman. However, they described him as sort of simple-minded and harmless, and had never threatened anyone or done anything violent. He was just a bit of a weirdo who couldn't take the hint. In what was a stunning display of small-town police ineptitude and sort of stupidity on the part of my father to allow it, the cops said they would speak to the guy and his parents whom he lived with, and basically tell him to knock it off, again. And so they did. And that very night, my parents received a phone call from this guy's parents, who apologized profusely and explained their son was a little socially off and never meant to hurt or scare anyone. They basically said that they told him to leave my mom alone, or they would get the police involved themselves. And in true, naive, small-town fashion, everyone just sort of shook hands and let it go. For a year, maybe more, there were no more sightings of him, no incidents. My dad knew where he lived now and occasionally would pass by to see if his car was at his house. I suppose it seemed that the gentle admonishment worked. However, that all changed one summer night in 1987. This part I remember well. It was about 9 p.m. and I was in bed, not yet asleep, and I could hear my parents watching TV in the living room. At some point I heard my sister leave her room and walk down the hall towards the den. Suddenly there was commotion and an air of panic. It appeared that my sister was having an asthma attack and was really struggling to breathe. This would be the first of many attacks that had her on an inhaler into adulthood. My dad was running one way, my mom another. I heard the shower come on in an attempt to see if the steam would open up her airways. I remember my mom starting to shout that it wasn't working and to call 911. At this point, I got up and stood in the hallway watching this unfold. I remember my dad yelling that he had called 911 and that they were on the way. My mom was still in the bathroom trying to get my sister to breathe steam. I'll never forget what happened next. I walked down the hallway towards the den and the staircase that led to the front door. It was a split-level ranch-type house built into the side of a hill, so you had to walk down a flight to get to the front door. I think I was hoping to find my dad, who was probably in the kitchen where the phone was, as I was starting to panic a bit over the situation. However, he ran past me towards the bathroom where my mom and sister were. Suddenly, at the bottom of the steps stood a young man staring up at me. The front door opened wide behind him. I yelled to my parents that the police were here, and I heard footsteps come running down the hallway towards me. It had only been maybe 1 minute since my dad had said he called 911. I can recall thinking even at 6 years old or so, wow, they get here fast. My mom came up behind me and proceeded to let out the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. It was the Stalker standing there looking up at us. I hadn't recognized him, so I was now thoroughly confused as to what was going on. My dad was about 3 seconds behind that scream, and when he got there, my mom screamed, "It's him! It's the Fing guy!" I will never forget the look of utter confusion on my dad's face as he had a daughter in the bathroom starving for air, and his wife suddenly in hysterics over a man standing in his doorway. Like, which Fing thing do you attend to first? Well, this dude took one look at my dad and bolted out the door into the dark. He started to follow, but I think quickly realized that he knew where the guy lived. And since it appeared he had run off, there was no immediate threat. He yelled at my mom to go into the kitchen, and she grabbed me in a state of blind panic and pulled me with her. About 2 minutes later, the cops arrived, and one of them was a guy present a year earlier after the initial encounters. My mom started screaming, "He's out there! He was watching us!" The cops were completely confused now as well. This was supposed to be a medical emergency, but suddenly, it was a home invasion. EMTs were quickly behind the cops and gave my sister a few shots of an inhaler, and she was breathing again. But now all attention was on the stalker, as it was clear that he had to have been spying on my parents through a window, and in his twisted mind thought he could save the day. The cops caught up with him running down the road and arrested him. He admitted under questioning that he had been going for drives at night for months now, and watching my mom through the windows from the woods. He didn't really seem to understand what the big deal was. Long story, way too long. He pled guilty to trespassing and some sort of stalking-related crime and went to jail, though I'm not too sure for how long. I have often thought about going back up there to take a look at what records are available on the case. Nothing seems to exist online. According to my parents, the lack of any threats or actual violence sort of rendered the story not newsworthy. My mom was so freaked out that my dad put in for a transfer, and we were back in Brooklyn by the fall. Although it's taken over 35 years, my mom can now tell the story with a laugh. But I don't think she ever got over that night. We found out from old neighbors years later in the late 90s that the guy had been in a group home post-jail and died from a heart attack.